Of the 12 battleships the Imperial Japanese Navy operated at the start of the Pacific War, 11 were sunk before the war ended. None of them was sunk by an enemy battleship. They were sunk by submarines running torpedo attacks from positions the battleships never detected. By carrier aircraft arriving in numbers, the anti-aircraft doctrine had not been designed to absorb. By the accumulated weight of an American industrial capacity that the Naval Staff had seen in the production figures and had chosen, in the years before the war, not to fully believe. In Yamato's case, by 386 American planes sent on a single mission with a single purpose. Dispatched from carriers, the Japanese Navy no longer had the aircraft or the pilots to contest. The weapon system the Imperial Navy had spent the 1930s perfecting, the great gun, the armored belt, the decisive surface engagement at long range between capital ships, was not the weapon system that determined the outcome of a single major engagement in the entire Pacific War. The doctrine that had promised otherwise was obsolete before most of the men assigned to those ships had finished their initial training. The Naval Staff understood this by late 1942, when the carrier battles of Coral Sea and Midway had already demonstrated that the decisive engagements of the Pacific would be decided by aircraft, launched from ships that never came within gun range of each other. The men loading powder charges in Yamato's handling rooms and standing watch in Musashi's fire rooms did not receive this assessment. They were trained for the fleet engagement the doctrine had described. They were assigned to ships the Naval Staff had privately concluded were too valuable to risk in the attritional fighting that was consuming the rest of the fleet. They were kept ready for a battle their own admirals had largely stopped believing would come, in conditions the Naval Ministry's honor narrative had never mentioned, and would not have recognized as relevant to the mission it was describing. That was the first contradiction. It was not the last. Begin with the machine, because the machine defined everything about how the men inside it lived and what it cost them to do so. Yamato and her sister, ship Musashi, were the largest, most heavily armed battleships ever constructed. This is not disputed. Yamato displaced 72,809 tons at full combat load. She measured 263 meters, 863 feet, from bow to stern. Her main battery was 9 46-centimeter guns and 3 triple turrets, each barrel 21 meters long and capable of firing a 1,460-kilogram armor-piercing shell, the heaviest naval projectile in the history of warfare, to a maximum range of 42 kilometers. Her belt armor at the waterline ran to 410 millimeters of Vickers hardened steel. Her machinery plant was 12 canpon boilers feeding 4 geared turbines, developing 150,000 shaft horsepower, driving the ship at a maximum speed of 27.46 knots. She carried a designed crew of 2,767 men. By the time of her final sortie in April 1945, her complement had grown to approximately 3,332. She was, by every measurement the Naval Ministry could produce, the most powerful warship afloat. She spent the middle years of the Pacific War at anchor in Truk Lagoon. This fact, that Yamato and Musashi, the ships built to be the decisive instruments of Japanese sea power, spent the critical operational period of the war avoiding the battle their existence was supposed to guarantee, is the central institutional lie that structured life aboard Japanese battleships in a way that the American and Japanese destroyer scripts cannot approach. Destroyer crews knew they were expendable and were used accordingly. Carrier crews were in constant action. Submarine crews were in constant lethal danger. Battleship crews aboard the great ships of the Yamato class were trained for a form of war their own Navy had stopped believing in and kept in reserve for a decisive battle that the Naval Staff privately doubted would ever occur. They're training for the decisive battle that is never coming, aboard a ship too valuable to risk in any battle, in conditions that the Naval Ministry's honor narrative obscured entirely. This was the specific form that Japanese battleship service took between 1942 and 1944, and understanding it requires understanding what those conditions actually were. The enlisted crew of a Japanese battleship like Yamato or Nagato was organized into a hierarchical structure that expressed the Imperial Navy's social philosophy with a directness that had no equivalent in Western navies. The distinction between officers and enlisted men was not primarily about authority and responsibility, though it was those things. It was about a different category of human being inhabiting the same hull. Officers used a separate entrance to board the ship. They used separate passageways when moving through the ship. They used separate bath facilities, separate mess facilities, and separate berthing, with a standard of comfort that bore no relationship to what the enlisted men experienced. An admiral's quarters on Yamato included a dining room, a study, and sleeping arrangements that would not have been unusual in a good hotel. A first-class petty officer in the engineering division slept in a hammock slung from overhead fittings, in a berthing compartment that held 60 men in a space measuring roughly the area of a large living room. These are not incidental details. They structured the psychology of the institution and the experience of the men. The enlisted berthing compartments on Yamato were positioned primarily in the forward sections of the ship, below the main deck, and in the spaces flanking the machinery plant amidships. The compartments had overhead clearance of approximately 1.8 meters, just enough for a man of average height to stand without ducking, and were furnished with the hammock system the Japanese Navy had retained from the 19th century. Each man was issued a hammock that he rigged to overhead hooks at sleeping time and stowed rolled in a marked space during the day. The hammock system was, in strict engineering terms, more efficient than fixed bunks. Hammocks could be removed entirely, opening the compartment floor space for damage control operations or other uses. In human terms, the hammock system meant that sleeping was a skill requiring physical practice, that the man above you, if the hooks were closely spaced, was close enough to touch, and that in heavy weather, the motion of a hammock amplified the ship's rolling in ways that produced seasickness in men who had been at sea for years. Yamato was not a good seaboat in a beam sea. For a ship of her displacement, this was counterintuitive, but her hull form, broad, short for her beam, with a high center of gravity generated by the weight of her turrets, produced a characteristic rolling motion in cross swells that the crew described with a specificity that appears in multiple post-war accounts. A roll to approximately 12 degrees and back, at a period that the engineering department measured at between 15 and 18 seconds, sustained for hours when the ship was in the waters around Truk or the Philippines in typhoon season. 12 degrees of roll sounds modest. On a ship 263 meters long, 12 degrees of roll at the ship's extremities, the bow, the stern, the turret tops, is approximately 9 meters of lateral movement. In a hammock, in a closed compartment with 60 other men, at 2 in the morning, in tropical heat, after a 12-hour watch period, this was not a comfortable motion. The heat on Yamato was documented in engineering department logs and crew accounts with a consistency that establishes it as one of the defining conditions of service aboard her. The 12 Kanpan boilers were grouped in 4 fire rooms, 2 forward and 2 aft, positioned in the machinery spaces amidships. The fire room spaces operated at temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees Celsius, 113 to 131 degrees Fahrenheit, during normal steaming. During high-speed operations, the temperatures in the fire room spaces adjacent to the working boilers rose above 60 degrees Celsius. At 60 degrees Celsius, human tissue begins to suffer thermal damage from sustained contact with exposed metal surfaces. The men working in those spaces wore as little clothing as naval regulations permitted. In practice, during the worst periods, reduced to loincloth and headband, and lost between 3 and 5 kilograms of body weight per watch through perspiration alone. The watch in the fire rooms lasted 4 hours. The men who completed a fire room watch emerged into passageways that registered 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and experienced this as relief. They moved through corridors where condensation dripped from overhead pipes, where the deck plates were warm underfoot through their sandals, toward berthing compartments where the temperature hovered between 32 and 38 degrees Celsius, depending on the ventilation system's capacity and the number of men sleeping. The ventilation blowers moved air through the ship, but could not cool it. In the Truk anchorage, in the waters of the Philippine Sea, in the approaches to Leyte Gulf, the outside air temperature was 30 to 34 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was 80 to 95%. Pushing this air through the ship's ventilation ducting did not produce comfort. It circulated misery at a higher volume. The food aboard Yamato was, by the standards of the Japanese fleet in the early years of the war, relatively good. This qualification matters because the standards of the Japanese fleet were not high. and because the trajectory of food quality on Yamato followed the trajectory of everything else in the Japanese logistics system. Adequate in 1942, strained in 1943, inadequate by 1944, and approaching critical by the final months of the war. The Japanese naval ration was built on rice as its caloric foundation, supplemented by dried fish, pickled vegetables, tofu, miso, and occasional fresh provisions when the ship was in port or receiving supply from a tender. This was nutritionally sound and culturally appropriate, and produced a diet that maintained the health of men doing moderate physical labor under comfortable conditions. It did not produce adequate nutrition for men doing heavy physical labor in sustained heat, while under the psychological stress of extended combat operations. The caloric requirement for a man working a fire room watch in tropical conditions ran to approximately 4,500 kilocalories per day. The planned ration provided approximately 3,200. By mid-1943, with the American submarine campaign against Japanese supply shipping intensifying, the actual ration being distributed aboard Yamato and the other battleships at Truk was falling short of the planned figure by margins the medical officers documented and forwarded to the Naval Staff, and that the Naval Staff absorbed without altering the supply allocation. By 1944, the men aboard Yamato were eating the same rice-centered diet they had always eaten, but the rice was older, stored longer in conditions that affected its quality, and supplemented by preserved foods that had been in inventory for periods exceeding their intended shelf life. The miso was still miso, the dried fish was still dried fish, but the fresh tofu that had supplemented the ration in better supplied periods was gone. The fresh vegetables were gone. The occasional egg, the occasional fresh meat, gone. What remained was the minimum, prepared by cooks working in gallery spaces where the temperatures during the cook cycle reached 50 degrees Celsius, who understood that they were feeding men who were increasingly hungry in ways that the official ration figures did not capture. Water aboard Yamato was produced by distillation plants with sufficient capacity for the designed complement. When the complement exceeded the design, as it did by 1945, the water allocation per man fell below the planned figure. The bathing and hygiene allocation was cut first, as it always was on every warship. Personal bathing for enlisted men occurred in communal bath facilities. The Japanese naval tradition of the furo, the communal bath, was maintained even aboard warships, which is one of the few areas where Japanese naval enlisted men had an advantage over their American counterparts. But the communal bath required water, and water was rationed, and by 1944, the bath schedule had been reduced to intervals that the crew accounts describe with a precision that reflects how significant the reduction felt, from twice weekly to once weekly to, in the final operational period, whenever the water allocation permitted. The smell of 3,332 men in a closed steel hull in tropical water, bathing infrequently, wearing the same uniforms through watch periods in 50-degree heat, is not something the official logs recorded. It is documented in the accounts of officers who came aboard Yamato from shore assignments after extended periods away, who noticed what the men who lived inside the hull no longer registered. The berthing compartment smells specifically: unwashed hammocks, unwashed men, preserved fish. The particular staleness of recirculated tropical air was described in one such officer's diary as entering the compartment like something physical, like a presence separate from the ship itself. He adapted to it within 2 days. He noted that this adaptation was complete and involuntary, and that he found it, in retrospect, more disturbing than the smell itself. None of this was the particular hell that Japanese battleship service generated in the period 1942 through 1944. The particular hell was the waiting. Yamato and Musashi were anchored in Truk Lagoon for extended periods through 1943, while the war in the Solomon Islands was consuming the destroyer force and the carrier fleet and the naval air arm. The battleships were at Truk because the Naval Staff had classified them as too valuable to risk in the attritional fighting that was destroying the rest of the fleet, and because the decisive fleet engagement that would justify their use had not presented itself in a form the Naval Staff was willing to accept. The men aboard those ships, 2,767 of them on Yamato, approximately the same number on Musashi, were conducting drills and maintenance and training for a battle that was not coming, in a lagoon that offered them nothing, in heat that did not relent, with the specific knowledge that available to any enlisted man who could look at the fleet's movements and draw conclusions, that the ships they served aboard were not being used for the purpose that their assignment to them had been presented as serving. Truk Lagoon was a protected anchorage with clean water and adequate depth. It was also, for a man assigned to a battleship confined to it for weeks at a time, a form of imprisonment whose walls were made of water rather than steel. Liberty ashore was limited. The island's facilities for enlisted men were minimal. The available recreation was what the ship itself provided. The ship provided work, drills, maintenance, and the specific combination of boredom and ambient heat that the crew accounts from this period describe, with a uniformity that suggests they were genuinely characteristic rather than individual complaint. Petty Officer Second Class Takashi Morimoto, a gunner in Yamato's 3rd Turret Division, kept a personal diary from January 1943 through September 1943, the bulk of the Truk anchorage period, that was recovered by his family after the war and partially published in a 1978 Japanese veterans' memoir collection. The entries from the Truk period are brief. This brevity is itself informative. A man who had something to describe would have described it. The entries record temperatures, maintenance schedules, the names of men who had been transferred off the ship, occasional notes about food. One entry, from March 1943, reads in its entirety, "The humidity today made the gun steel impossible to hold. We wrapped the barrel housings with cloth. It did not help. Drill completed." No entry the following day. The drills were serious and sustained and reflected the Naval Staff's genuine intention to be ready for the decisive engagement when it came. Main battery drills on a Japanese battleship of the Yamato class required the coordination of turret crews, fire control personnel, magazine handlers, and communication specialists across multiple decks and multiple compartments simultaneously. A full main battery drill ran between 4 and 6 hours. The turret crews for Yamato's 46-centimeter guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship, numbered approximately 100 men per turret, distributed across the turret proper. The powder handling room, immediately below it, the powder magazine, and the projectile stowage. The handling room personnel moved powder charges. Each charge consisted of 6 silk bags, each bag containing 83 kilograms of propellant, from the magazine to the hoist mechanically. But the hoist required operators and the process required coordination, and the heat in the handling rooms during a full drill was between 45 and 55 degrees Celsius. 100 men per turret, 3 turrets, 4 to 6 hours, in spaces running 45 to 55 degrees. This was the training that was supposed to produce the decisive battle result. There is a specific documented moment that reveals what the Japanese battleship's strategic situation actually cost the men who served aboard her in terms of the gap between what they were told they were preparing for and what was actually happening to the war around them. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, American carrier aircraft conducted Operation Hailstone, the mass raid on Truk Lagoon that destroyed the anchorage as a functioning Japanese naval base. Yamato and Musashi and the other capital ships had been warned and had sortied before the raid. They escaped. The ships that did not escape, cruisers, destroyers, supply vessels, auxiliary ships, were sunk in the lagoon over 2 days. Approximately 270 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The lagoon that had been the combined fleet's primary Pacific anchorage became a navigational hazard of wrecked ships. The battleships that escaped watched the smoke from a distance as they moved to new anchorage at Palau. The men aboard Yamato watched the smoke column from Truk rising above the horizon for hours. The smoke was visible for most of the day on February 18th. Morimoto's diary entry for that date is one of the longer ones in the Truk period. It contains no analysis, no emotion, no commentary on the strategic implications of what he was watching. It records that the smoke was visible from approximately 900 until the afternoon watch, that the color shifted from black to gray to white as the hours progressed, and that the cook that evening served rice with dried plum. That entry contains more information about the psychology of Japanese battleship service than most of the official records. The refusal to record the obvious, that the fleet's primary anchorage had been destroyed, that the ship had fled rather than fought, that the war was moving in a direction the doctrine had not prepared for, reflects something real about the institutional framework that surrounded these men. You did not record conclusions in a diary that might be read. You recorded facts: the smoke, the rice, the plum. The rest you kept in the calculation you did not share with the man in the next hammock. The numbers that define Japanese battleship service across the war deserve their concentrated moment here, because they tell a story the official histories consistently understate. Of the 12 battleships the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned and operated, Yamato and Musashi, the two most powerful warships ever built, fired their main batteries in anger at surface targets on exactly one occasion each. Yamato's main battery engaged American surface forces at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, specifically during the Sibuyan Sea action and the battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. Her 46-centimeter guns, designed to sink American battleships, were fired at American escort carriers, ships displacing less than 10,000 tons built on merchant hulls, crewed by men who had no reason to expect to be facing the most powerful battleship guns in the history of naval warfare. The escort carriers survived primarily because Yamato's fire control system was not optimized for small, fast-maneuvering targets, and because the engagement was broken off before her ammunition expenditure could be converted into the decisive result the Naval Staff had been planning since the 1930s. Musashi never fired her main battery at a surface target in combat. She was sunk on October 24, 1944, the day before Yamato's engagement off Samar by American carrier aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. It took an estimated 20 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits to sink her. She took approximately 3 hours to go down from the first hit. Of her complement of approximately 2,399 men, 1,023 were rescued. 1,376 men went down with a ship that had never fired her primary weapons in combat. The operational planning document for Operation Tengo, the Yamato sortie of April 7, 1945, contains a passage that is worth rendering precisely because it states the institutional position in terms that remove any ambiguity about what the Naval Staff understood it was doing. The document states that Yamato and her escorts were to sortie toward Okinawa with fuel sufficient for a one-way voyage, beach themselves on the Okinawa coast if still operational, and fight as shore batteries until their ammunition was exhausted and their crews were dead. This was the mission. It was not framed as a sacrifice in the official document. It was framed as a tactical option within the larger defensive plan for the homeland, but every officer who read it understood what it meant. The men who survived Leyte Gulf, who had been through the Sibuyan Sea battle and the Samar engagement and the withdrawal that followed, returned to Kure Naval Base in late October 1944 as the remnants of what the Naval Staff still formally classified as the main striking force of the combined fleet. By this point, the designation was a bureaucratic artifact. The carrier air arm had been destroyed at the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The cruiser force had been gutted at Leyte Gulf. The destroyer force had been consuming itself since Guadalcanal. What remained was Yamato and a handful of other ships, insufficient fuel to operate them at full capacity, and the specific situation that the Naval Staff's final operational planning in 1945 would address in the only way it could. The crew of Yamato on April 6, 1945, the day before the sortie, numbered approximately 3,332 men. They were told various versions of the operation's nature, ranging from a full accounting of the one-way mission to vague descriptions of an important offensive operation. The specific information individual crew members received depended on their rank and their officer's judgment about what was useful to tell them. What all of them knew, from the fuel load and the departure speed and the absence of air cover that a return voyage would have required, was enough to understand the mathematics. Morimoto's diary ends on April 5, 1945. The final entry records that he wrote letters to his parents and his younger sister. He does not describe the content of the letters. He records that the evening meal was particularly good, white rice rather than the lower-grade mixed grain that had become standard, and fresh fish. He notes that several men in his division spent the evening playing shogi. He records that the weather was clear and that the stars were visible. That is the last entry. On April 7, 1945, at 12:37 in the afternoon, the first of approximately 280 American aircraft reached Yamato's position in the East China Sea, approximately 200 nautical miles north of Okinawa. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. Yamato was struck by an estimated 11 torpedo hits concentrated on her port side, the standard tactic for sinking a ship by flooding rather than explosive damage, and by 6 bomb hits. At 14:23, she rolled to port. The roll continued past the point of recovery, and the ship capsized. As she went over, her forward magazines exploded. The explosion was visible and audible from Kagoshima on the coast of Kyushu, approximately 200 kilometers distant. Of the 3,332 men aboard, 269 were rescued. Morimoto was not among them. His diary was with his family in Kochi Prefecture. His parents had received it from his sister, to whom he had given it before the sortie with instructions that she should keep it and return it to their parents. This detail, that he had given the diary to his sister before departure, which means he had brought it ashore during the day in port on April 6th, which means he had made a specific decision about where the diary should be when the ship did not return, is recorded in the preface to the 1978 memoir collection, in which portions of the diary were published. He was 22 years old. He had served aboard Yamato for 2 years and 4 months. He had participated in no engagements that resulted in enemy ships being sunk. He had stood watch in a gun turret that had fired its weapons in anger on one occasion, against targets it had not been designed to engage. He had spent the most strategically consequential period of his service in Truk Lagoon, drilling for a decisive battle, recording temperatures and meal contents and the names of men who were transferred off the ship, watching smoke rise from a distance when the battle came to the anchorage without invitation. He had eaten the good rice on the evening of April 5th and written to his family and watched the stars. That is what it cost to serve on a Japanese battleship during the Second World War. Not the glory the Naval Ministry's literature had described, not the decisive battle the doctrine had promised, the rice, the stars, the calculation made and not shared, the diary given to a sister before the ship sailed with enough fuel to go one way. The 3,063 men who went down with Yamato on April 7, 1945, did not die in the decisive battle the institution had spent a decade preparing them for. They died waiting for it. And when the moment finally came, it arrived not as the fleet engagement the doctrine had envisioned, but as 280 American aircraft sent to sink one ship, in waters the Japanese Navy no longer controlled, on a mission the Naval Staff understood was final before the sortie order was written. Morimoto's sister kept the diary for 33 years before it was published. She said, in the brief account she provided for the 1978 collection, that she had read it many times over those 33 years, and that what stayed with her was not the difficult days or the heat or the shortages or any of the conditions that the historical record had made familiar. What stayed with her was the ordinariness, entry after entry of temperatures and meals and drills and the names of men. A life documented in its specifics rather than its meaning, by a man who had understood, perhaps, that the specifics were what would remain after the meaning was gone. She was right about that.